All right. It's 9:30. I'll go ahead and start. I was waiting a little bit because I know we trickle in a little bit and I do it too and um I'm afraid I've gotten so excited about this information and I talk really fast sometimes. I'm afraid I'm going to fly through it. Um but anyways, I chose this topic, women of the church, because it interests me. I went to 2 years ago at the Gospel Coalition for Women. I went to a class by Mike Kruger, and he talked about women of the early church, which is really where I began my interest in this. And it was just about women and like just the simple things that they did in the early church. And by early church, he means second century, the first century. I'll talk about it in a minute. The first century after the apostles have kind of died off, and there's nobody around that lived and walked with Jesus to help guide the church, and the church was really on its own. So he talked about that. So it's kind of I got really interested in the early church as well as women's roles and what women did and how important they were even. In the early church, and from there, I just have been reading about a lot of women and in the church from what I consider a proper view, not a modern feminist view of women in the church. Anyway, so that's why I chose this topic. It goes along with a class that Buckrun teaches, 6 Christians you should know in different areas, and I just chose 6 Christians, 6 women. This week is not really going to be about any particular woman. I am going to talk about one at the end, but just women of the early church in general. So anyway, I've kind of gotten ahead of myself. I'm going to start off in prayer. And if everybody wants to say a little prayer for me, sometimes I get a little nervous when I talk in front of people. And anyways, but I think this is interesting, and I think that you guys will like it. So, anyways, alrighty, dear Lord, thank you so much for letting us be here today. Thank you for all these women, much more than I thought would show up. That I came here early to learn about you, and to learn about women's roles in the church, and just to come here to be encouraged, Lord. I pray that you would use me to encourage them, and maybe even just to get them excited about what we can do as women and what women have done in the church, Lord. Lord, I pray that you would just help me deliver the information in a way that's effective, and that would glorify you, Lord. We love you, and in Christ's name I pray. Amen. So, all right. I'm kind of just as a little background. I'm an anti-feminist. I'm pro woman, but in what I consider the biblical view of pro woman. So, anyways, our current culture devalues or tells us that Christianity devalues women. Do you agree? And do you agree that they have told us that Christianity has devalued women from the beginning? Would you say that? And that Christianity is anti-woman, it's a masculine-ish, religion. And so, do you like in your mind now, from what you know about the early church, do you think that was true? Do you think that the early church devalued women? No. No. So some people may know more, but yeah, but you would feminists would tell us that they do. Um, and I'm going to tell you that they don't devalue women. And so I would say, where do we find our value? Do we find our value in the fact that we're a woman, or is our value in our identity as Christians? Um, anyway, I think this is important. I have 4 girls. It's important to me to find out the truth of what the Word says and what God says about women in the church. So this is one of my references was this fun little book. It's called Feminine Threads, Women in the Tapestry of Christian History. And one of her quotes, the author Diana Lynn Severance says, "The standards for Christian women and the church should always be the scriptures, not any individual or group, regardless of their influence or charisma." And I think that's just important. I mean, a lot of people have a lot of charisma and influence, but they are not the standard for what women should do in the church. So, all right, starting with women of the early church. And by early church, again, I mean, I'm specifically talking about second century because Michael Kruger, he wrote this book called Christianity at the Crossroads. And just as it's a really fun little book. I've only read I've skimmed through all of it, but it doesn't even have an audiobook, and I've read it. So that should tell you how much that I'm interested in that, because I was really bummed. I was like, please come up with an audiobook before my class, and it never did. So I read it. But it's really fun. Michael Kruger got me all fired up about this when I went to his TGCW talk a couple years ago. So first century is 1 to 99. Second century is 100 to 199, and first century is what the New Testament writings kind of cover that time period. And the second century is past the New Testament writings, but when the early church is really on its own for the first time, they don't really have any, like I said before, living church fathers that are guiding them through. And to me, that's just fascinating. Like, really, what would we do? I mean, what would you do in that time, in a time that's hostile to your religion, and you don't have anybody guiding you that ever really walked with Christ? Um, and they have the New Testament writings. So anyway, at that time in the Greco-Roman world, Christians were very weird, which I would say it's becoming true again today. We're now weird again. Which, so when I was born, and probably a lot of when you guys were born, Christianity wasn't weird. It was normal, especially if we grew up in the Bible Belt. But Christians were becoming Christians in a world where they were weird. And I'll go through those reasons later. The Roman government did not view the spread of Christianity as a good thing. Christianity in the second century was beginning to part ways from Judaism. Judaism was considered a separate religion that was specific to one ethnic group, right? But Christianity was spreading to the Gentiles. So Christianity was spreading to lots of different ethnic groups. And it was seen as more of a threat. And so they were not given the protections that Judaism was, because Judaism was these are the Jews, they're an ethnic group, and this is their religion, and they're not really hurting anybody. But Christianity was not granted those protections or that favor. So because of this reason, persecutions would spread up. Persecution was a very real threat. It was not necessarily widespread and happening all the time, but it could happen at any time where you lived, and it was very locally, persecutions and martyrdoms occurred. Um, uh, so anyway, if it sprung up in your area, it could be severe, and it was always a threat, but it wasn't necessarily always happening all the time. So that was another thing that kind of interested me about early Christianity, was the threat of martyrdom, because that just freaks me out. I'm not gonna lie, like I've had nightmares at night just thinking about what if physical persecution ever comes to me, or to America. What in the world would I do? I mean, I don't even want to be talked badly about on Twitter, much less, some of the things that people go through. So that was really real to me. But it's also very encouraging to hear the stories of, I won't go into the details of some of the, unless you want to hear them later, of some of the martyrs, just the strength that they had. I mean, you cannot read what they went through and think that they did not have the Holy Spirit in them guiding them through that. I mean, it was incredible. So let's see, where am I? So, one of the things was that Christianity, because, okay, there's a government. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I won't get ahead of myself. All right, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. There was a governor in the second century named Pliny. Anybody ever heard of Pliny the Younger? No? Okay. He sounded to me, he's like a normal name now. Just read so much about him, Pliny. He began to be very concerned with the Christians. He was he was very skeptical, and he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan at the time, and basically was like, Christians, they're everywhere. They're in every rung of society. They're in men. They're both. He was like, they're even in both sexes, men and women, rich and poor. All socioeconomic free men, slaves, everybody. Like, they're everywhere. He's called them a contagion. Like this Christianity was basically a disease that was spreading, and he was very concerned about it. So the Christians met in secret, and so some religions in the past had caused revolts because they were meeting in secret, and they wanted to know what these people were doing. So I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to tell some of the stuff I'm about to tell. He ends up questioning some people and finds out that he was like, okay, they're actually not doing anything bad. They actually are just talking about how to live and to not lie and to not steal and to not commit adultery. But still, they're Christians and they need to be taken care of. So, I mean, that kind of gives you an idea of the environment of the day. Like, really, just the fact that they were Christians is what bothered people. Um, and Man, I'm trying to like just blurt out every information. I get so excited about it. I'm trying to follow my outline. I won't tell everything right now. So let's see. The majority of I'm giving you a background of the early church so that I can then talk about women a little bit. The majority of Christians were lower class, but this is not unusual because most people in the Greco-Roman world were lower class. Most of the Greco-Roman world was fully illiterate. There were different stages of illiteracy. Some people, you were fully illiterate if you couldn't read or write, but some people could write their name, so they were somewhat literate. Scholars seem to think that only about 10 to 15% of the Greco-Roman world could read and write, which is, the big picture is much different than today. Christians, this is interesting to me, were actually called atheists and impious. Like, okay, so they were in a world. Sometimes when I think of the Greco-Roman world, I think of like a secular world, and Christians were the religion. No, and that's not true. Greco-Roman world was a very religious world. I mean, they had lots of gods, and then obviously you're like, okay, that's true. But they were a very religious God, and they did it very publicly. And unlike today, it was a really public, not a private thing that you kept to yourself. I mean, it was a state and public religion. So they expected everyone to worship these gods because then in turn that would bless their society, and maybe not bless, that's a Christian word, but like that would profit their society. And whereas Christians were worshiping this weird invisible God, that and they only would worship one God. The Romans, the Greco-Roman world, allowed people to worship anybody they wanted. I mean, you just had to kind of worship everybody. So I know I see lots of themes that are very similar to today's society. We're just a secular world. You can believe anything. You just can't say you only believe one thing. It's kind of the same way. I mean, although Rome was very religious, and that Christians were seen as atheists and impious. This is Michael Kruger's book. He's the president of the Reformed Theological Seminary. You may know his wife, Melissa Kruger. Anybody read any books by Melissa Kruger? He's I love hearing him talk. He's very interesting to me. There's a quote in here where he says, Christianity was deemed to be a threat. Refusal to worship the gods and to potentially invoke their wrath was viewed as recklessly endangering the Roman people. For Christians to do so was viewed as a blatant disregard for the welfare of their fellow citizens. This is why, no doubt, Christians were charged with hatred of mankind. I thought that was very, very interesting that Christians were thought to hate mankind. So their refusal to worship the gods caused them to be labeled as a superstitio. I can't really pronounce it, and not a religion. And so one of the definitions of superstitio, that's where we get superstition, but is an irrational religious awe. So anyway, so that's a little background of the early church, just the world where the early church was growing up in, just a polytheistic world that viewed them as a threat and weird. So anyway, so this to me, the next statistic I'm going to tell you is so fascinating. I want you to think about it. How prevalent do you think Christianity in the early church was among women, if I haven't already told you? Have you ever really thought about it? Like, what were there many women in the Christian church? We know there were, but like, how prevalent? Anybody ever thought about it? Does anybody think, do anybody want to guess or just think of it to yourself? This is interesting to me. 2/3 of Christians were women. Is that not amazing? Of the Christian church, the early Christian church that was undergoing this kind of persecution and everybody thought they were weird, 2/3 were women. So what does that tell you? That there was something good about Christianity, right? There was something that was drawing women to Christianity. And even more interesting is that in the Greco-Roman world, the population, the broader population, was actually only 1/3 women and 2/3 men. So it wasn't like, 50-50. It was only 1/3 women, 2/3 men. And this is a religion that was exact opposite. It was attracting 2/3 women and 1/3 men. Do you get that? Is that interesting to people? That was super fascinating to me. I thought, why in the world? I just would never think that there were that many Christian women in the early church, which to me, because I'm sitting here today talking to you about Jesus and talking to you about God, means they did something right, right? I mean, it's still here today. Christianity still thrived, still survived, with two-thirds of their members being women. I think that's amazing. I don't know. That's interesting, though. We should look that up. Modern day statistics. But I never would have thought. I thought maybe, I don't know. I never had thought that before, but I would have probably said a quarter were women. I really don't know. Or half. I definitely wouldn't think that there were more women than men. So anyway, that statistic was first presented to me by Michael Kruger. Were you in that class? Did you go at the TGCW a couple years ago? And I was just blown away. And so I was so interested in this from then on out. So um, this is going back to my statement that Christianity devalued women in the early church, and I'm saying that's not true. There's the fact that the broader Greco-Roman world was one third men and one third women and two-thirds men. The reasons for that are because they were very anti-woman. The broader culture was anti-woman, and I'm going to tell you why. But how can a religion be anti-woman if it was brought into a world that was anti-woman? Does that make sense? That implies to say that the early church was oppressive to women implies that the culture that it was brought into was not, and that's just not true. You cannot take our situation today and apply that to the Greco-Roman world. That was just not true. So anyway, I love that because I think that that may come to a shock to today's feminists. But anyway, so one of the major practices that to me is horrifying was female infanticide. Women just really were not valued. So Roman families often only had one girl, so they could have as many. Girls were seen as a drain on their finances. Um, they could have one girl, and after they had one girl, they would, if another girl was born, they would, what they called, it was called exposure, or they would discard it. If it was born, it was a girl, then they just left it out in the elements and she died. And I know it was, that's, to me, that's horrific, especially because I was talking to my husband about that. I said, if our family were an average family back then, we would have discarded 3 of our girls. Like, they just wouldn't have been important. They were just a drain on our finances. And that just, to me, that's horrifying. Um, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but to me, that's one thing that drew Christian women to Christianity initially, is that they didn't have to kill their babies. And that's why women grew, because they were born into Christian families that allowed the women to survive. Um, there's in some of my resources, I was reading a letter. They have a lot of first century or primary sources, which I think are really interesting. And there was a letter from a Roman man to his wife, and he's just writing back to her, and he said, and apparently they had a son already, and she was pregnant and was going to deliver any day. And he said, it was just a sweet little letter, like, kiss our son for us and take care of him. And if you deliver before I get back, if it's a boy, keep it. And if it's a girl, just get rid of her. And, in your last letter, you talked about missing me, and I miss you too. I was like, what? Like, just like nonchalantly, if it's a girl, just get rid of her. And that just to me is horrifying. But just gives you an idea. The reason that they showed us that letter in this book was like that was just common. Like, and people thought that was okay. Um, another, yeah. So let me backtrack. I'm talking about why the Roman world was not very welcoming to women or pro-woman. One of the things that would not have gone a woman's way was the divorce, not necessarily the divorce laws, but just the divorce culture, that they could, there's kind of like a no-fault divorce, and when men could just divorce women for whatever reason. They also had child brides. Sometimes women or girls were married off very early. and the sexual ethics of the time greatly favored men and not women. Men were basically allowed to do legally ish whatever they wanted to do, and could have multiple women. They had a wife that was for childbearing, but then they could have other women for whatever reason, but that was not allowed for the women. Um, and so, another reason that there may have been more men than women was that so many women died during childbirth. Um, and they had abortions back then too, which affected their fertility and could also be um, dangerous. So many scholars believe that these reasons led to the popularity of Christian among women. I kind of just got ahead of myself and told you some of them, because some of the reasons why it was popular among women were also the reasons why uh, the statistics in the Roman culture were 1/3 women, 2/3 men. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some social reasons why scholars think that more women were attracted to Christianity. The first one is the dignity that they were allowed in marriage. Because of what I just said, the sexual ethics of the world were that the men were allowed to do basically whatever they wanted to do. Not that every Roman family did that, but that was just allowed. Here's a quote from someone back at that time that says, "We keep mistresses for our enjoyment, concubines to serve our person each day, but we have wives for the bearing of legitimate offspring and to be faithful guardians of the household." So that just, I don't know what sounds more oppressive, the Christian's view of marriage or the Greco-Roman world's view of marriage. I kind of have threads in here of like why I don't think that Christianity was anti-woman, that go against what feminists say. But you would imagine, I mean, you can imagine today, who would you choose? Would you rather marry a Christian man or a man who thought it was okay to have concubines and prostitutes and mistresses and whatever? It was just, you had more dignity in marriage. You were allowed to, you remained faithful, and that was just not normal for men at that time. Although not normal to be allowed. I'm sure there were a lot of families that did remain faithful, but as a whole, this was the culture. They were also, like I said about the female infanticide, they were attracted to this religion because they didn't kill their babies. Like just if you have like we have innate value built inside of us, like we know we're valuable as a person, and just to be able to say that we can have our girls and keep them, that had to be, you had to be drawn to that. I mean that the Christians were keeping their girls, and they had larger Christian families. Um, and another one, which is I think some of you may have been interested in this when you saw the class, were that women had real roles in the church. They were actually valued. Um, so here's the Christian church that didn't just say, yeah, you can join, but they were like, yeah, you can join, and we have work for you to do. And as I've said, clearly they did the work well, because we're still sitting here today. I'm not going to talk a lot about the individual roles, but I'm going to tell you some of the things that they did. Let's see, and they had dignified roles. Let's see, I'm getting ahead. They hosted house churches. I'm sure you've heard of the house churches. That was a big deal. They had benevolence ministry. I think this is interesting because benevolence ministry, what they mean by that is they had, for Christian women that had finances, they would finance a ministry but then work it themselves. They would like finance in their own ministry. To us, that's a big job, like to finance a whole ministry and then to do it ourselves. And I think we kind of dichotomize that a little bit, like, this group we need money from, and these are our workers, and like they just didn't have that luxury back then. If there was something to do and they had the money to do it, they financed it and they did it. They had mercy ministry. They ministered to the widows and orphans and prisoners, because by prisoners, a lot of these prisoners were just people that were in prison because they were a Christian. And what's interesting about that is that there were some ministries that used their widows and orphans to do the prison ministry, and they used their widows and orphans to do the work. So they didn't just they weren't just a drain on the finances. They helped the widows and orphans, but then the widows and orphans then in turn worked as church members. So there wasn't, it wasn't like, well, because you need help, you just need help. It's, you need help, and we're going to help and support you, but then you're also going to work. And it wasn't, I mean, they did it out of, that was just the norm. Um, Women did missions. Women catechized children. They evangelized pagan women, and they did teaching at the time. There was like a time period of when you started learning about Christianity. It, there began to be this practice where you weren't like immediately baptized. You went through a period of learning. And when they were preparing for baptism, women, it wasn't seen as proper for men to be alone with women. So the women would teach other women. And I think this is interesting because as I was reading about that, they called them deaconesses, and not so much an official title, but a deaconess as a servant who served and taught other women. And I thought they had an official, like, it wasn't an official title, but they had a specific role for women to teach other women, and they taught them doctrine. They taught them theology. This is another thing that the Greco-Roman world thought was weird about Christians, was that we cared about doctrine and we cared about theology. They just cared about rituals. They just cared about, we worship these gods, whatever these gods want, and we worship them so that they will cause society to work well. And then Christians had one God, that when we had a Bible, that was weird because it was a Bible and a book that was a guide to life, and that was just strange at the time. And that women, and that Christians were actually critiqued because we taught women. Because they said, "Oh, that, one of the things of the day was that silly religion. It's for silly people. It's for uneducated people. It's for women and children." So that was actually a put down on Christianity. It's just there were so many women. It's just for women and children. And not only that, they actually teach their women. Like, how silly is that? That they just thought it was so silly. And this is the world that Christianity was growing up in. But I'm glad that they taught women, and 2/3 of the church were women. So one of the things that stuck out to me about that was that this was like an early women's ministry, and women were expected to know the word themselves. And I have a plug about that. Jen Wilkin wrote a book called Women of the Word, and there's actually a Bible study that's starting up, or a book study that's starting up on January 21st. You can talk to Janice about it if you want to, or come up here. But it just goes through how to really study the Word for yourself, not just read it through in a year, not just do a devotional. Not those things are all good, but how to actually read the Word and study it for yourself and really understand what it means. And I've read this book, and it's amazing. It's life changing. I loved it. I could go on more about that, but it just shows you that there was early women's church, women's ministry. So anyway, all the roles of the women I just said were just basically tell us that, yes, there were lots of things that women can do. Women didn't just sit at home and make cookies for the church meetings. They were actually, although they probably did, but and I'm sure the men probably enjoyed it. But there is no shortage of actual real work for women to be done. I make cookies. I'm not saying that's bad, and I make appetizers for people when Secret meets in my home. But there's just more to it, It's not like, well, that's just my gift. That's what I do for the church. I cook. That's good. That's good. I'm not gonna say that's good, but there are actual. If you find value in doing other things, that there is work to be done, and that our heritage as Christian women is that Christian women have done this from the beginning. Okay, if you have your Bibles, to me this is so interesting. I'm kind of going all over the place, I know. But Romans 16. Paul is writing a letter to the Romans. And you get to Romans 16, which he's done with his letter, and he starts his greetings, which is funny that their greetings are at the end, but whatever. But so I have totally missed this until one of these books pointed this out to me. So if you're at Romans 16, the very first person he mentions, I think they mentioned like 28 names or something, and 1/3 of them are women. You probably didn't know that because you didn't know which names were male and which names were female. But even as early as Paul, who is seen by a lot of feminists as anti-woman, he's commending up to 1/3 of these people to greet were women. But very first one. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Centria, I'm not sure, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you. For she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. So, like, when you go back, that you may welcome her. So he was in Corinth, right? Corinth, I believe, at the time. Anyway, he didn't take the letter to the Romans. He actually gave it to Phoebe. He gave it he gave his letter to the Romans to a woman to travel from one city to another to deliver it, and she delivered it successfully. And has Romans impacted anybody in here today? I mean, so the fact that we have Romans, John Piper calls it the greatest letter ever written. The greatest letter ever written was entrusted to a woman to travel from one city to another, and she did it well. I just think that's crazy. And that Romans was essential in the conversion of Augustine, Martin Luther, John Wesley. I'm sure many other people too. I mean, how many? I mean, and just in our church, I mean, Romans is just very important. All the whole Bible is, but Romans especially. But just that such an influential letter was traveled and specifically given by Paul to a woman who he trusted to take to them. I just think that's fascinating and encouraging. So anyway, some of those I've gone through some of the social reasons why women in the early church would have been attracted to um, Christianity. But as I was doing that, I thought, well, that sounds really shallow too. Like that, oh, well, I like this religion because it benefits me as a woman. But they were also drawn to Christianity for intellectual reasons because, one, they were valued. Their minds were valued. They were actually taught doctrine. So for intellectual reasons, women were taught doctrine, and women were entrusted to teach doctrine and theology to their children. And that they were allowed to do so. And this is in a society that's illiterate. So we would, in our world today, if you're illiterate, you're not really interested with a whole lot. But anyway, they were. I've already said this because I've gotten ahead of myself, that critical sources mock Christianity as a religion of uneducated people, although most of the people in Rome were uneducated, but of uneducated women and children. And they were mocked for actually teaching their women. But I think that shows that Christianity values women and values what we know, and values what we are able to teach. And it shows you that women of the time did value theology too. So I think it's like just the whole picture, that the church valued women valued theology. Just everything. That women were seen as equal in men in their ability to learn about doctrine. I've already said that this is another reason why Christians were weird, was because they had a book that was a guide to life from their God. That was seen as really weird. Um, I already mentioned, because I got ahead of myself, the role of women as a deaconess, which was like a servant, and that was specifically to serve and to teach other women at some point in some places. Um, and I talked about the Women of the Word Bible study. See, I know I was like, I'm going to get all ahead of myself and just go, and it's already 10:02. Oh my goodness gracious. So, okay, I'm done. That's the early church. So that's just an overall picture of the early church. So I had to give you like a little picture of that, and then what the women's roles were and what the environment was for women of the early church. I thought that was super, super interesting, and I read a whole lot about it, and I tried to take everything I read and put it in a few minutes here. So anyway, hopefully that encouraged you, that women were a very, very big part of the early church. They had a huge role. The work to be done by the church, because it was 2/3 women, a lot of it was done by women. So I think that's just really, really encouraging. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that stuck out to me as I was reading the early church was the whole issue of martyrdom. And because that's really like uncomfortable for me. Tertullian was a church father in North Africa, and he actually was quoted as saying, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." The Romans, they thought that by doing this, and these were horrid, I'm not going to give you details, but horrid things that they did. They thought that by doing this in a public spectacle, and they did it as a sacrifice, like to their gods, as part of their religious, sometimes they would do it in their arena, and as part of games that were for their gods. They would use Christians to to torture and kill eventually. But they were trying to dissuade people from converting to Christianity, and it did the exact opposite. There are some scholars that say that every decade the Christian church grew 40% until it was legalized. So I mean, it went from like 20-ish people to like I don't know the numbers, 40 million. I don't know, it was a lot. It was incredible. The fact that it grew 40% in the midst of persecution, it grew 40% every decade until it was eventually legalized. I thought that was crazy. Um, I didn't realize it grew. I mean, I guess I knew that it grew, but I didn't realize to what extent and in what hostile environment that it grew that much. I was going to talk about two people, mainly Perpetua. Has anybody ever heard of Perpetua? Um, the first one, though, Perpetua is not technically in the second century. She was born in the second century, but was martyred at the very early third century. But there was a slave girl from Gaul in 177, and her Gaul is present day France. Her name was Blandina, and she was actually described by other people in literature as like being frail and having a weak constitution in society. She was a slave and she was a girl and she was weak, and so um, she wasn't expected to be very strong. Well, at the time, her town became hostile to Christians. This could happen. Someone could say they're meeting in secret and they're planning something, and then persecution could spring up. And that happened in her town. And so they find the Christians, and they grab them and they bring them into the forum in the city, and they start questioning them. And some of them recant their faith and they're allowed to go home, but some do not, and those are imprisoned. And Blandina was one of them. Um, she was eventually taken to the arena. You know, they do this for a big public spectacle, and so with a few other people, a few other Christians, and one. I think it's interesting to hear what the spectators and what people there said about how they withstood this. They said that her witness, this little slave girl that was said to have been like just frail and little, was the most bold. And that even her that first day, even her torturers said that they couldn't break her. Like they couldn't do anything. I mean, like horrible things were done to her, and they couldn't break her. She ended up having to go back to prison. Um, uh, she um, she was, yeah. I'm not gonna say all the details. The first time that she was in the arena being tortured in this spectacle, an onlooker actually said that she was so small and frail, but looked as though she were clothed with Christ, who was the something like the perfect athlete or something like that. Because anyway, she comes back a few days later. They bring her back after she had been in prison a few days, and they said that she looked like she was rejoicing, as if she was coming to a marriage feast and not to be devoured by animals. Um, so anyway, lots of, I'm not going to say it out loud, but because lots of crazy, horrible things were done to her. And they said, I mean, these things, I mean, you would just, I mean, okay, my daughter passes out when she gets a flu shot. I mean, these things right here, I mean, I just can't even read them without, I was reading them one night. I was like, why am I reading this? I'm going to have nightmares. It's really bad. But all these things were done to her, and they said she did this, she withstood all these things, all while looking like she was in no pain due to the hope that was in her. I mean, I thought, and that was encouraging to me. I thought, okay, if something ever happens, like Christ will get me through. I hope that. I mean, I know He will, but I hope I don't feel any pain like they did. But yeah, I mean, I just thought there are a lot of things like that where people actually began to believe in this God that these people believed in because of how they withstood persecution. I mean, to me, that's incredible. This was a time when, and this is why they said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, because they were trying to dissuade people, and people right there watching them be martyred for being a Christian began to believe. I think that's incredible. Um, so anyway, that was her. I was going to read some, but I'm not going to read you a little bit more. I can show you where some information is. The next one is Perpetua. She was born in the second century, but was killed in 203. She was in. She was from North. She was from North Africa in Carthage. That was a Roman province at the time. She was actually of noble birth. She came from a family of high standing. So she was actually taught how to read and write. So the reason we know so much about her is she has the very first currently existing written document by a Christian woman. So she kept a journal while she was in prison. She was imprisoned for being for converting to Christianity, and she kept a journal. So we actually have her words about what happened. So we have her words about her time in prison, and someone else completed it when she was killed. But that was very interesting because, especially when you think about, I had told you earlier about the illiteracy rates. I mean, only 10 to 15% of people were could read, and families only had one girl usually, and so she was the only, from what I can tell. I don't know. I think she had two brothers, and it was just her. Anyway, she was very doted on by her father. She was fluent in Greek and Latin, and she knew how to write. And God used this to have her write down her journal, which we can use today. The Catholics are very interested in her, and she's a very large part of of Catholic traditions. But at the time, she was just a part of the church. Um, so let's see. She was with a group of arrested with a group of Christians that they were called catechumens. They were people that were new Christians that were learning about Christianity but had not yet been baptized. So the year before she was martyred, the emperor had issued a decree making it illegal to convert to Christianity because it was growing so much. Um, so she obviously was learning and was in the process of converting, and so they had somehow been turned in, and they were arrested while they were meeting in secret in a house. So there were, I think, 5 of them that were arrested and put under house arrest. Her father comes to the house where she's under house arrest and tries to dissuade her. I mean, thinks like, just stop, recant, offer the sacrifice, come home. Oh, I forgot to tell you, she was a new mom, so she had a nursing baby, an infant. That we don't know much about her husband. People have ideas about why he's not really mentioned, but those are all just speculation. But anyway, he tries to say, come home to your family, come home to your son, just say you're not a Christian, just come home. And she this is like a famous thing that she says. She points over to a vase and says, Dad, look at this vase over here. Can it be called anything other than a vase? And he says, no. And she's like, just like I cannot be called anything other than what I am, a Christian. And so, I mean, she knew what was probably going to come, and she had multiple opportunities to recant and would not do so. Not that everybody did that, because some people did. So the catechumens were baptized under house arrest, and they were so officially put in prison for converting to Christianity. While she was in prison, other Christians visited her and them, and they bribed the guards to get them special favor, get them out of she called it like this dark dungeon that had no lights. It was terrible. It was gross. And so there were multiple times that she was allowed to talk to other Christians, and her dad would come to visit her. People point out that that's interesting because the Christians already knew how to work the system of people being in jail. And those Christians apparently weren't in this situation, weren't in trouble because they hadn't recently converted after the law. So apparently they were allowed to come. But it was the recent converts that were being persecuted. She's known for her visions in prison. Some of them are kind of bizarre, but the first one was her brother says, "Oh, Perpetua, she's had visions and he said, ask the Lord for what's going to happen to you. Are you going to be set free, or because she hadn't officially been tried yet? Are you going to be set free, or are you going to be killed?" And she has a vision that night, and it's of a very thin like ladder, and on each side of the ladder are like weapons that can hurt you and tear you up, and at the very bottom is a dragon. She calls it like a dragon or a serpent that's guarding the entry to the ladderway, or the ladder. And people point out that this shows like obviously what she had been taught in a short amount of time, like some of her theology, like Jacob's ladder, and then the narrow way, the ancient serpent or dragon, the serpent of old. And in her vision, there's one of the Christians that had not been arrested with her was actually at the top leading, saying, "Come on, Perpetua, come on, be careful not to fall." She had to step on the serpent to get onto the ladder to go on up. But so she had to get by the serpent, step on his head. And they said that kind of shows her that she obviously heard about, that her heel will bruise his head because she steps on his head and gets up without being hurt. So the interesting part is that the guy, Satyrus, was one of the teachers. He had not been arrested with them, but he was the one at the top of the ladder. So when she wakes up the next day, she just is very calm. She's like, I'm to die. When she gets up to the top, she sees like a white haired man who's a shepherd. He gives her milk that's sweet. And he's like, Come, child, I've been waiting for you. And they're like thousands of bright people in robes. And she just, yeah, calmly just said, I'm going to die. And it is. And that just shows also her that she was taught about God's sovereignty, that, and if he willed something and just that it was going to happen. I was just amazed by just how calm she was about this whole thing. I would be beside myself, but I don't. Yeah, I just think their courage was just very encouraging to me. Um, so multiple times her father comes to visit. He keeps trying to get her to recant and say she's not a Christian. He even tells her like, give up your pride. Stop doing this. Like look what you're doing to your family. Look what you're doing to your son. I thought it was interesting. They said, give up your pride. And she refused. Well, they finally came to the official public trial where they take them up and they're given one last chance to make an offering for the emperor's sake. So what they're supposed to be doing is to make an offering to the gods that will in turn, honor the emperor. And she wouldn't do it. None of the ones that had been arrested with them would do that. And so they were officially put in prison. A little later, the guy Satyrus, who was in her vision, had felt like God wanted him to join them in prison so that he could minister to them as they were waiting. So he actually turned himself in and went into prison with them so that he could help them through this time. Um, I was going to say some stuff about what happened, but I'm not going to say it. Eventually, the person who she gives her diary or her journal to somebody else, and then somebody else finishes what happens to them. But what they talk about is as these prisoners, and especially Perpetua, was marched to the arena, just like how calm she was, almost rejoicing. And I mean, yeah, I go back to thinking like how freaked out my kids are when they are marched into the doctor's office for a shot. I mean, just the peace that they had. And they said that they were, things that people were saying to them, and then, but the onlooker said they were cheerful and bright in confidence. They said, we come to die for Christ, not for your gods, because they were using the Christians to die as part of this like ritualistic games for their gods. When they get there, they try to make her wear the garments of the priestesses of their gods, and she refused. They were just talking about how bold she was. She was like, "No, you promised you did not that you would not do this to us, and that we did not have to wear this." And that even even then they were like, okay." Like she was just so bold. She would not go. She was like, "I'm not going to die in wearing your gods' garments." She begins to sing in the arena, and they say to the people that were putting it on, like, you have condemned us, but God will condemn you. And that enraged the people. And so they added extra punishment. They scourged, I don't know how, like, scourged them. They ended up saying they had to be scourged before they were thrown to the beasts. So all of them were scourged, but they didn't. They actually rejoiced. It was written down that they were rejoicing, that because they had that, they were allowed to share in the sufferings of Christ. I just think about how much some of us try to avoid the sufferings of Christ, and they rejoiced in that. But that's, not. I'll go back to this later, but some people were seeking martyrdom for their own glory, and that was at the time the church said, don't do that. That's like, if you're martyred, take it in confidence and be calm, but don't seek after it, because that's for your glory, not for the Lord's. They had, anyway, like I have this scene written down, but I'm not going to say it. She ended up finally, like the beasts wouldn't kill them, and they actually finally had to kill them with swords in the arena. And Perpetua was the last one. The guy that was holding her sword missed and hit her collarbone, and she yelled out, And they even at the end of her life, like took his trembling hand, it said, and like guided it to her throat. Like she was like, I'm like, she just went like with without being scared. They said they never reviled the Romans around them, like other than just saying you condemn us, but God will condemn you. Um, and anyway, yeah. So that I can read you. I mean, you can read more about exactly what happened. But to me, it was all sobering, but also just the fact that they remembered her as not being scared and having so much confidence. And it's like there is no way that you could go through that without having Jesus, without having the Holy Spirit give you that strength. She at one point she was actually trampled by a mad heifer, and she gets up and says, "When are they going to put that? When are they going to dispatch that heifer on us?" And the people were like, "You've already been trampled." She didn't even know that she had been hit. And then she looked down and she was like all bloodied and stuff. But, anyways, they actually on Amazon Prime, if you have it, they have a kids version of this story. It made me cry, but I know it's like a little morbid, but it's not. They don't tell you all the details, but they still show some of the animals. But it's called Torchlighters. Is that what it's called? Torchlighters. Um, it's very interesting. It's free on Amazon Prime, but you can watch it, and it just shows you just like her confidence the whole way. I mean, it was just so encouraging to me. But anyway, so because that's one of the only written accounts we have of women, like that's one that we can put a face and a name on, of one of the women of the early church, and just how seriously they took it. There were no social Christians. You didn't just go to the secret meeting for whatever reason. I mean, if you were going to be a Christian, you were going to be a Christian for a reason, and you knew the sacrifice that it might call on your life, and you took it seriously. Um, and yeah, I just think that the early church is very encouraging. I'm thankful for them because we're still here today. Um, and I'm thankful for the people who, given many opportunities to recant, would never say that they were not a Christian. I think that that's just when you apply that to your life today, and when you may be afraid to say, or not afraid, but tempted to remain quiet about your faith, that they, in the midst of being persecuted physically and greatly, were able, like, not just to say they were a Christian, but to shout it out, like, we are Christians and we're not going to die for your gods. I just think that that's incredibly encouraging. I don't know. Hopefully, you guys thought this was interesting, and that learning about women of the early church, that you can just think about it, and just kind of just the more I thought about it, the more I read about it. I have some resources. This is Michael Kruger's Christianity at the Crossroads, about the Christians of the second century, and there's no audiobook. And then there's no audiobook to this either. Feminine Threads, Women in the Tapestry of Christian History. This is very interesting because the girl who wrote this actually wrote it to go against the current feminist culture, because she's like, okay, feminists are rewriting history to say it in their viewpoints, and she did this to say this is like what actually happened, and I think it's interesting. This is a video on the Passion of Saint Perpetua. It's like a video of it. I don't know where you get that. I got that on Amazon, but that's like the adult version. It's like a documentary. There's also the Torchlighters on what's it called? Amazon Prime. And then, have you ever heard of Fox's Book of Martyrs? It's been in my house for a long time. I've never touched it. And then I read it, and I was very interested. Oh, there's one more I did want to show you. There's another young lady a few years later. She was watching sorry, I know it's almost time to go. I said I was going to fly through it, and here it is, almost 10:30. She was watching another man be tortured and killed, and he, in the middle, he wouldn't recant until the very end. I mean, he was like, he'd gone through so much, and he finally recanted. And she says to him, she's only 16 years old, and she says out in the middle of this public torture, "Oh, unhappy wretch, why would you buy a moment's ease at the expense of a miserable eternity?" And because she said that out loud, they took her and tried her and killed her. But just like just the boldness that they had, even in in the face of it. I mean, I don't know if if you were in the midst of public persecution right now, or anything, even just verbal social persecution, would you stand up and say, "Oh, unhappy wretch, why would you die? Why would you buy a moment's social ease on Twitter for an eternal condemnation?" But I don't know. I just think it's very interesting. I won't go on and on and on. I'll end us in prayer, and we'll have an extra 5 minutes for us to be done. Dear Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you just for letting us gather to learn about your church again, and just thank you for these women who are interested in you, and just learning more about you, learning more about your church. Lord, I pray that you would help us use this to encourage us, and allow us to be bold in this culture, Lord, and allow us to grab hold of the roles that you would have us have, Lord, biblical roles, not to usurp authority that's not given to us by you, Lord, but to embrace who you've made us to be, Lord, and that we are valuable, and that we can do big work, and that we can do good work for you, Lord. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.